The last time I saw my grandmother, she told me I'd never leave her house. I thought she was joking. Granny had always been the playful type, with a wry sense of humor and a mischievous glint in her eye. But there was something different in her voice that day, something unsettling. I didn't think much of it at the time. I laughed it off, kissed her cheek, and promised I'd visit again soon. Life got in the way, as it always does, and I never made good on that promise. Until now. It's been 10 years since I last set foot in Evergreen, Alabama. 10 years since I walked through the creaky front door of that old house on the edge of town. And now, here I was, standing on the porch with a duffel bag in one hand and a sense of unease settling deep in my chest. Granny needed help, my mother had said. She was getting older, and someone had to look after her. I figured a few weeks in Evergreen would be a nice break from the city, a chance to reconnect with my roots, clear my head, and maybe even find some peace. But as I reached for the doorknob, that uneasy feeling tightened its grip on me. Somewhere deep in my mind, a voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." The house welcomed me with the scent of old wood, lavender, and something else, something faint and metallic like rusted iron. Granny's voice called out from the kitchen, warm and familiar, and I followed it, leaving the strange feeling behind. She looked older than I remembered, her hair a little grayer, her hands a little more frail. But her eyes still had that same spark. She pulled me into a hug, and for a moment, everything felt normal. "It's good to have you home, Liam," she said, her voice soft. "I've missed you." "I've missed you too, Granny," I replied, forcing a smile. But as the days went by, that smile became harder to maintain. The first few nights in Evergreen were uneventful. I settled into a routine, making breakfast, helping Granny around the house, and taking long walks through the quiet town. But every night, without fail, I woke up at exactly 3:03 a.m. At first, I thought it was just my body adjusting to the slower pace of life. But then I started hearing things. It began with whispers, soft, almost imperceptible, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. I'd sit up in bed, straining to listen, but the moment I focused on them, they stopped. I told myself it was nothing. Old houses made noise. The wind could sound like voices if you listened hard enough. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. One night, I decided to follow the whispers. I crept out of bed, careful not to wake Granny, and tiptoed down the hall. The whispers grew louder as I approached the basement door. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob, but before I could turn it, the whispers stopped. Silence. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, from the other side of the door, I heard it, a single sharp knock. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. For a long moment, I stared at the door, half expecting it to open, but it didn't. In the morning, I asked Granny about the basement. "Don't go down there," she said, her tone unusually stern. "There's nothing for you in the dark." A few days later, I saw her for the first time. I was in the garden, pulling weeds from the overgrown flower beds, when I felt it, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. I looked up, and there she was. A woman stood in the window of the abandoned house next door, her face obscured by shadows. She didn't move, didn't wave, or call out. She just stood there, watching. I blinked, and she was gone. Later that evening, I asked Granny about the house. "Abandoned for years," she said, not looking up from her knitting. "No one's lived there since the Thompsons moved away." "But I saw someone," I insisted. "A woman." Granny's hands paused, her needles falling silent. She looked up, her eyes narrowing. "You must be mistaken, Liam," she said, her voice calm but firm. "There's no one there." I didn't argue. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching me. The following night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unnervingly close. They started at the end of the hall and made their way toward my room, each step punctuated by the creak of old floorboards. I lay frozen beneath the covers, my heart hammering in my chest, each beat louder than the last. "Granny?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the doorknob began to turn. I bolted upright, reaching for the lamp on the bedside table. My fingers fumbled with the switch, and when the light finally flickered on, the door was closed. The hallway was empty. The next morning, I tried to shake off the fear, blaming it on a vivid dream. But when I mentioned it to Granny, her reaction was unsettling. She set down her teacup, her hands trembling slightly. "Sometimes the house remembers," she said, her voice distant. "Old memories can linger, you know, especially in a place like this." "What do you mean?" I asked, a chill creeping down my spine. She shook her head. "It's nothing, dear. Just an old woman's musings." But it didn't feel like nothing. It felt like a warning. Later that day, I decided to do some exploring. If the house had secrets, I was determined to find them. In the attic, beneath a layer of dust and forgotten memories, I found an old wooden chest. Inside was a collection of faded photographs, yellowed letters, and a leather-bound journal. The journal belonged to my grandfather, a man I barely remembered. He had passed away when I was a child, but I had always heard stories about him. How he built this house with his own hands, how he loved Granny fiercely, and how, toward the end, something changed. I flipped through the pages, the handwriting growing more erratic with each entry. The shadows are watching me. I hear them at night, whispers in the walls. "I don't know what's real anymore." My breath caught in my throat. The things he described were eerily similar to what I had been experiencing. One entry, dated just days before his death, stood out. "The woman in the window isn't real. None of it is real. It's all in my head. But if that's true, why does it feel so real?" I closed the journal, my hands shaking. Was it possible that I was imagining everything? That, like my grandfather, I was losing my grip on reality? The days blurred together, each one more surreal than the last. I stopped mentioning the strange occurrences to Granny. Part of me didn't want to worry her, but a bigger part didn't trust myself. The whispers, the footsteps, the woman in the window, they all felt real, too real. But the journal had planted a seed of doubt in my mind. One evening, I decided to confront the source of my fear, the basement. Armed with a flashlight and a resolve I didn't quite feel, I descended the narrow staircase. The air grew colder with each step, and the metallic scent I had noticed before grew stronger. At the bottom of the stairs, I found nothing but old furniture and cobwebs. I exhaled a shaky breath, half laughing at myself for being so paranoid. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a small door half hidden behind a stack of boxes. I approached it slowly, my heart pounding. The door was unlocked, and when I opened it, I found a small, windowless room. In the center of the room was a chair, and on the chair was a mirror. I stepped closer, my reflection staring back at me. But something was off. The reflection didn't move when I did. It just stared. I don't remember how I got back upstairs. The next thing I knew, I was sitting at the kitchen table, my hands gripping a cup of cold coffee. Granny sat across from me, her eyes filled with concern. "Liam," she said gently, "I think it's time we talked." She told me about my grandfather, about how he had suffered from schizophrenia in his later years, how he had seen things that weren't there, heard voices that didn't exist. He didn't want to believe it, she said softly. He thought the house was haunted, that the shadows were real, but it was all in his mind. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The whispers, the footsteps, the woman in the window, they weren't real. None of it was real. "I think you should see someone," Granny continued. "A doctor, just to be sure." I nodded. too numb to argue. The following week, I visited a psychiatrist in a neighboring town. The diagnosis didn't come as a surprise: schizophrenia. The doctor explained that stress and isolation could trigger episodes, and returning to a place filled with family history may have been the catalyst. Medication helped. Slowly, the whispers faded, the footsteps ceased, the woman in the window disappeared. But the house still felt different. One evening, as I packed my bags to return to the city, Granny hugged me tightly. "Remember, Liam," she whispered, "your mind can play tricks on you, but you are stronger than your fears." I left Evergreen the next morning, the old house growing smaller in my rearview mirror. Months later, I still think about that summer, about the things I saw and heard. I know now that they weren't real, but sometimes, late at night, I wonder, what if the house remembered? What if some shadows linger longer than others? And what if one day they come back?